just for you and me. Alright. Welcome to the podcast where we set you free. Hey, hey. We got the groove and the wisdom you adore. Yeah. Come and join the journey, cause there's always more. Cosmic Wisdom Podcast, rocking every day. Woo! Press play and let the magic take you away.
Welcome to the Cosmic Wisdom Podcast with your host, Haru. Today, all the way from Canada, we got Gregory Ian Robinson, who's sharing his latest research on the medicinal effects of psylocibin. Join us on an amazing and insightful interview to learn more about how to improve human health one magic mushroom at a time. This is episode 1 of the Cosmic Wisdom Podcast. Welcome to the first episode of the Podcast of Wisdom. I am Haru, your favorite artist, magician, musician, and multi-talented person. We're going to have an interview with Gregory Ian from Canada.
Yes, Gregory Ian Robinson. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Basically, you do research on psilocybe mushrooms?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, we do quite a bit. I'm doing my PhD in Canada. And there's a few labs in Canada that can actually do research on psychedelic mushrooms. And so we're one of 2 that I'm aware of in Canada and that do research, including growing psychedelic mushrooms, but we do a lot of testing on the medical applications, which there's many universities in Canada and the US that are doing research on using psilocybin for medical uses.
Awesome. That's very interesting. I know that psylocibe is being researched a lot in many areas, in many places of the world, and I'm really interested in what you have. The first question is, what inspired you to pursue a PhD in this field?
Yeah, it's a great question. Ironically, my mom wanted me to become a medical doctor, and I decided I did not want to do that, so she made me promise to become a doctor. So the PhD was the only other thing I could do. But I was doing research before then, and so I kind of liked it. And in Canada, US, it's a very reputable job. You can make a fair amount of money doing it. In Canada, you're never going to be rich, but you can make improvements, to people's lives, and you can help people. But specifically psychedelics, I was not originally doing research on psychedelics. I did my master's studying cannabis, because when I started my master's, cannabis was legalized in Canada at that time. And there was a lot of research to be done that we just didn't know what the effects for cannabis were. And things like my research at that point was looking at if it can cause, if mothers were to consume cannabis, would that cause defects in their babies while they're pregnant? And long story short is, yes, it does. Do not consume cannabis if you're pregnant. But after my master's finished, I then was looking around to see what else I could do. And at that point, I found a lab doing psychedelic mushroom research, and I thought that was really interesting. And I thought that would be the next thing in Canada, is that after cannabis was legalized, down the road, probably psychedelics would as well. So that kind of just pushed me to go into that area, because I knew that there was so little that had been done in cannabis, and then it kind of just blossomed. But now psychedelics is that same area. At least when I started, nobody had really done much research on it, but a lot of people were fascinated by it. And there's reports that it could even be better than cannabis for various medical purposes. And I would absolutely agree with that. It's better than cannabis.
Nice. Very curious about what makes Canada a better place to study these things. Why it has a future in Canada. That it's interesting to know.
Yeah. So for psychedelics, this is really interesting, is that it's not decriminalized. It's technically still illegal. But in certain places in Canada, like Vancouver, which is on the west coast in British Columbia, they openly sell psychedelics, and the police in Vancouver don't care. They've even said on news channels that there's nothing wrong with them selling psychedelics, as long as they don't do anything else that's illegal, like anything that, if they're not paying taxes, they would go after them. And so in Vancouver, there are legal people they're not legal. They're illegally selling psychedelic mushrooms and psilocybin, and they don't care, and they still pay taxes, and they collect the taxes, and they're not ever shut down. But in certain places like Montreal, that did not happen. One place opened up, and the same day it opened up, the police shut it down. So in certain places, it's basically legal, in all purposes, but it's technically not legal. The other thing that is also a really good reason why Canada is great for this is that there's what's called special access program. So pretty much anybody in Canada can go to their doctor and try to get their doctor to get them to essentially ask for permission to legally use psychedelics or psilocybin for some disease. So I think there has been a few cases, like a lot of people, they're end of life. So they're about to die because they had, say, cancer and they were severely depressed. They had a lot of various problems. And so it was more for humane reasons that Canada then granted them to get access to psilocybin. At the same time, Canada also has licenses that corporations can actually go and get a license to legally grow psychedelic mushrooms. And so I've actually started my own company to help bring some research funding. So that's another reason, is that we get a lot of research funding in Canada to do research on this.
Awesome.
And so I've started my own company and we've brought in a fair amount. It's probably about a couple $100,000 Canadian dollars that we brought in so far, which is really good. It's still not enough. We obviously want more, but it's great that we can bring on people to actually do things. Obviously, there's a lot of restrictions that what we can use the money on and what we can't, but it's really good because of that. People can get access to psilocybin if they ask for permission and it's granted. It's not always granted, but you can ask, whereas most countries you can't. It's just illegal. We have people that grow it, and it's this is like GMP facilities. So in order to actually sell it to someone in Canada and have them actually legally use it by having this special access program, the people growing it have to have up-to-date, it's called good manufacturing practices, so that whatever they're taking, it's not going to have any sort of contaminations. There's going to be no problems. There's no, it's not improperly made, so that there might be something else in there. So it's very well regulated. So if you do get access to psilocybin, it's actually psilocybin and it's not going to be something else like another drug. And so because of that, we have really well-regulated area. Obviously, we want it to become decriminalized. Not everybody, but a lot of, especially the researchers, knowing the benefits of psilocybin. But that's probably still a long way down the line. I would say probably 5 to 10 years. We probably will have a new prime minister in 2025, but he probably won't make improvements in that area. But the next one after that, we would assume might. So probably 5 to 10 years, we might have legal or decriminalized psilocybin, especially with all the data showing how beneficial it can be.
Absolutely.
And compare that to the US. So the US, obviously, someone might say, well, why not do research in the US? The US psilocybin is a Schedule II drug, I believe. It's essentially, not only is it illegal, but the way that they classify psilocybin is they say at a federal level, there's no medical application of psilocybin. That's the technical term, even though we know that's not true. We know there is medical applications of psilocybin. So their legislation and how it works in the US is that it's illegal. They'll probably change it at some point to just make sure it's updated, that they change the way they classify the drug so that there is potential therapeutic benefit. But right now in the US, it's technically illegal going across from state border to state border. So like if you are in California and you need to get psilocybin, and maybe in California, well, that's actually a bad example. Let's say you're in Oregon. In Oregon, it's decriminalized. So you can technically have psilocybin and use it, and it's not, no one's going to go after you and send you to jail.
No, yeah.
Right? But say you wanted to get it from California, where it is illegal, and you were to bring it into Oregon, then at that point, the federal government could say, well, you crossed the state border. This is interstate travel with a drug. We can now go prosecute you. Whereas if you're just in Oregon and you just bought it in Oregon and you never took psilocybin outside of Oregon, then you would be fine. So the problem with that is in Canada, we don't really have those problems. Everything is more federally regulated, and it's more, we work together. It's more about reasonable use of something that has therapeutic value. And so that's where, compared to the US, we have a lot of benefits and more funding right now. That will probably change. Obviously, the US has more money, but they haven't really invested as much until recently, probably until the last year or two. They hadn't. So
you're kind of ahead of the back right now.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We've done so much more. I mentioned there was 2 labs, and we're one of them that can grow it and do research on growing psychedelic mushrooms. That's something that is more done illegally in the US, so people will know how to grow it, but we have done it scientifically in Canada. And so we've made some pretty big improvements in Canada on how to have more stable production of psychedelic mushrooms. And so this is a big problem area, actually, is that when you buy psychedelic mushrooms, you don't know how much psilocybin is in it.
Yeah.
Right. And obviously we test it, but more importantly, it fluctuates a lot, the amount of psilocybin, even in somewhat standardized conditions of growing it. And so in Canada, we've made major improvements to now we can grow psychedelic mushrooms. And without even testing it, but we will test it, without even testing it, we know how much psilocybin approximately is there. Whereas you might get in the US, they might say this has got, 5 milligrams of psilocybin, and it might actually have 30 milligrams if you're using a psychedelic extract. And so because of that, you're thinking you're taking a very small dose and you're taking maybe a massive dose, right? So the quantity can really fluctuate by, we've seen it tenfold the difference just because they don't know how to grow it properly. And so that's something in Canada we've been doing now for multiple years, scientifically, which has not been done in a lab at the US. The first one just actually got granted by the DEA. So that's the Drug Administration in the US at Ohio State University. So I knew this was a year ago. The first one was approved there at Ohio State to do research on actually growing psychedelic mushrooms. So they are many, many years behind us. Like we have had these licenses for probably about 10 years. Yeah, so they're really far behind us. And that's why Canada is just such a great place to do research for psychedelic mushrooms.
Interesting. Do you think that public awareness of the psychedelic mushroom is evolving right now in Canada? Like people know about it?
In Canada, 100%. You just never know about, it's hard for me to make that judgment in other countries. I know in Canada and even the United States, I go to the US quite a bit. It is unquestionably evolving quite a bit. Compared to 5-10 years ago, nobody really even wanted to talk about psilocybin 5-10 years ago. And now, I have people regularly come up to me and say, hey, by the way, just so you know, because you're a researcher on this stuff, I take it. I'm not supposed to tell you this because it's illegal, but I take this and it's massively helped me in X, Y, and Z various use cases. A lot of people take it for pain. They have pain and that can help them. People take it for depression, anxiety. There's many reasons to take it, but a lot of people come up to us and tell us that now, but 5 years ago, you would never have anyone admit that. So I think in Canada, it's really, really growing ever since cannabis was legalized in Canada. So that's since then, everybody that does like psilocybin started talking about it because they're like, maybe we can get it legalized. And that's when I think everybody else started realizing, oh, there is numerous people having these massive benefits from psilocybin and very little to no downsides of it.
Interesting there. That's what makes psylocibe so special. You don't get a hangover like for consuming psychedelic psylocibe.
So I'd like to make a joke, and to be fair, we need to do more research on it. But I like to make a joke that the only downside or negative of psilocybin is if you take enough of it, you're gonna be out for a day. Essentially, you're gonna be having some fun, but a lot of people take it for that reason. So is it really a downside or a negative? I would say probably not. That being said, I do have to state we need to do more research in various areas and to make sure it is 100% safe long term.
Yeah. Well, the psilocybe, like many psychedelics, create this effect of the delusion of ego, or the idea that some solid structures from our survival and thriving can get diluted. Do you think that is beneficial at some point for society?
Yes, that's a great question. So there has been a lot of research using various imaging technologies that looks at both the structure of the neurons in your brain as well as the blood flow. And those are two very important things in the brain. And what they find when people take psilocybin even once is it changes the way your neurons are connected, and it changes the way that you might perceive certain responses and what parts of your brain actually activate in response to that. And so that's a very scientific and technical way of saying taking psilocybin even once can drastically change the way your brain functions. And importantly, it is almost what most people would assume is extremely beneficial. It generally makes you more in touch with nature. It makes you more communal, makes you more care about society and other people. And as you said, it helps get rid of ego, right? And so that is something that we have known, and there's been a lot of actual clinical studies on testing what the effects are after you take psilocybin. And so it can be greatly beneficial because we're living in a world right now that's growingly becoming more, we care about our country and our people only. And there's wars going on, and with various new presidents and prime ministers and new governments forming right now, it is a concern that maybe there could be more wars coming up pretty soon. And obviously we don't want that. And I think if some people did take psilocybin, that would definitely change things for sure.
Interesting. The use of psylocibe to basically create a more peaceful society might be a possibility.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And it's not just in that regards. Like I think one of the big problems and use cases of it, in particular the United States, is that they have a massive mental health crisis in many areas, but specifically in their veterans that go to war, previously have gone to war.
Sure.
They come back, they have what's called post-traumatic stress disorder, and they can't really hold a job. They become homeless. Right now, their government really hasn't even cared about them under this most recent president, which probably by this time is released. The old president, they had prioritized, interestingly enough, illegal immigrants over their own war veterans that had served the army and served the country. And so a lot of these people, they don't have a job, they don't have much money, they laid on the streets. And it's really unfortunate because the main reason because of this is that they have PTSD, they're having a lot of stress, their anxiety, depression. They can't operate the same way that most people can. And if they just allowed them to take psilocybin once, that would drastically change things. And that's what clinical trials actually show. It's unquestionably beneficial. I know the new U.S. president and his group of people have suggested that we should just decriminalize it and start handing out psilocybin because it is so beneficial for society. And so it's not just that it can reduce ego, but there's so many ways that it can benefit society and just change society entirely. Like imagine in the US, obviously they do have some homeless problem there, but a lot of their veterans that want to serve their community can't. And if they were to take this and get better, who knows what they would be doing to serve the community and make America better. I'm not going to say a slogan, but you know what I have.
Absolutely. Interesting. One of the things that I always liked when I researched psilocybin use for mental health or physical health, specifically mental health, which is my area of research. Yeah. Basically, I saw some MRI scans, basically, and like they seem to show a coherence in the brain activities, in the neural activities. Like when you see an MRI of a brain that's not on psilocybin, it looks disordered, and then you take an MRI of the brain under psilocybin, and it looks like more harmonious. I know your expertise might not be on mental health precisely, but I'm interested if you ever had the chance to see an MRI scan or some kind of neurological study on that.
Yeah. Well, I haven't seen the scans myself, but I have seen papers. These are scientific articles that have done exactly this. And it does change, when we're using an MRI, it does change what lights up, changes blood flow and the connectivity. But I believe with an MRI, it shows the blood flow is my understanding. And it changes it in very specific areas. And the brain is a really complex and difficult thing to understand. And so generally more is not always better. Sometimes less is better, but sometimes more is better in terms of in terms of blood flow or where it's going and what's being connected, right? And so it's a very complex area that is hard for me to comment fully on, but it does change where blood is flowing to, where the neurons are connected. And definitely, when you say harmonious, I just got to be careful here because I'm not an expert in this field, but sometimes different parts of the brain that are far apart can activate together and work together, and it's beneficial. Sometimes areas close by, or sometimes all of the areas working together is a good thing, but sometimes it's a bad thing. It really depends on the circumstance and what we're talking about. But almost all of the studies, if not all the studies that I've seen with MRIs, it's always been beneficial. And I think it's usually there's more activation in the brain and it's connected in specific areas. I know there is some areas, like even ones you wouldn't think is beneficial, but ones where it's about stress and a few other, you would normally think that this is a bad thing that it's activated with, but one of the interesting things about psilocybin is it helps you emotionally process negative events. So you would normally think activation area that deals with negative events is bad, but it actually activates with that area, with other areas in your brain to actually process previously negative events. So that way your mind can actually get past it and get over it. And so psilocybin doesn't, and for PTSD and depression, doesn't stop you from feeling these things. It doesn't stop you from experiencing or even remembering negative events, but it actually changes the way you perceive it and can move past it.
Okay.
And that's a lot to do with blood flow and the connectivity in your brain. So if you have different neural legions, you could say harmoniously working together and better than previously after you take psilocybin.
You have mentioned like blood flow a couple of times already,
Yeah.
which means that there might be, probably you already proved that, lots of benefits on blood flow and how nutrients are sent to the organism.
Yeah. So when we're talking about blood flow, definitely it's when there's more blood flow, that means that brain area is more active usually because it needs more nutrients, right? So when there's more blood flow, that means that brain area is more active. It uses the resources there. The body then senses that and sends blood to that area so that the brain's not going to die, right? They can't let that happen.
But your current specific research right now is not on the brain or the mind, but on other areas. Can you explain us right there?
So I was co-leading a project with a postdoc during my PhD, and this was sponsored by actually a company called Good Cap Pharmaceuticals, and they wanted us to just carry out this project that they were interested in. And it was the use of psilocybin by itself, as well as another compound called eugenol. So this comes from a couple of different plants.
How do you spell that?
Eugenol, it's EUGENOL.
Okay, eugenol.
Comes from various plants, but they activate different receptors and they work a little bit differently. And so the idea was specifically psilocybin. Eugenol is already known to be an anti-inflammatory, but it's still a little bit novel. Psilocybin, I would say it would have been 10 years ago, maybe. There's maybe a few that I don't know about farther back, but there was a couple big studies 10 years ago that basically showed psilocybin when you give it to macrophages. So these are immune cells in your body that produce inflammatory compounds. So this can be both good and bad depending on the situation, but they can be inhibited by psilocybin. So generally we have a lot of chronic diseases that inflammation plays a large role, where usually you have an overactive immune system producing a lot of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. So they're just molecules that change the way your body behaves. And generally, if it's a pro-inflammatory, that generally means it's not good for your body. Think of it as maybe you rolled your ankle and your ankle becomes very swollen and red. That's due to inflammation, right? When we have chronic diseases, generally it's at more of a microscopic scale that you have this inflammation in your body, and that can negatively affect things. Like you can have inflammation in your brain, and that can even be lethal and usually contributes to a lot of different chronic diseases in the entirety of your body. And so this animal study that we did, we tried both psilocybin by itself, eugenol by itself, and then combined it. In mice, we used it in mice, orally fed it to them, and we did it in an inflammation model. So we actually gave, it's called lipopolysaccharides, LPS. It's from a bacteria, and when your body receives it, it induces a major inflammatory response throughout the entire body.
Oh.
And so we actually inject that into their stomach of the mice, And then either before or after, we feed them psilocybin or eugenol or both. And essentially, this was the very first study on animals to look at inflammation. And we did it because we knew that psilocybin can drastically decrease the production of these inflammatory compounds from macrophages, which is like the most important immune cell producing.
They look like the machines, right? The macrophages.
Yeah. The little machines will attack things and produce a bunch of these cytokines going around all of it. They're everywhere in the body. And most organs have their own what's called resident macrophages, which is macrophages that are just always there in that organ. But then a lot of the times when you have some sort of, so say that there's something, maybe you had too much alcohol and your body then says, oh, you're having some problems in your liver. Maybe there's some dead cells or something. Send some macrophages over there to go deal with this. And it's actually a beneficial thing to have an immune response. This is what helps keep things like diseases, like viruses. It will go after viruses and bacteria to attack it and to stop it from causing damage. But when you have it excessively and continuously for years, this can cause chronic diseases. And this is included in things like diabetes. This is in various liver diseases, and even in depression and various neuronal diseases. It's pretty much I don't want to say every, but a lot of chronic diseases. Inflammation plays a large role in that. And if you can reduce inflammation, specifically the pro-inflammatory cytokines that act negatively in that disease, if you can reduce those, then you greatly improve the outcomes from that disease. And so we did the first animal study in the entire world using psilocybin as an anti-inflammatory. Yeah. And so this was the very first study that anyone's ever done on it. And we studied the brain. We studied the intestines, so both the small intestine and the large intestine, as well as the liver. And so my PhD project is actually on the liver in particular. That being said, I did quite a bit in both of those, all of those projects, because I was one of the people leading this animal study.
And also, I imagine that you have to also go through the research of how psilocybe works in other parts of the body as well, right?
Yeah, you have to know how it works, because one of the things that when we do our research, we figure out, okay, not only do we want to see that it's reducing inflammation, how does it actually reduce this? And we have to go study that. And so we got to look at what receptors does it bind to, what are the pathways that it affects. And we don't know what it affects in the liver, but we can go look at other areas like psilocybin has been given to mice before to see in the brain what it does. And we know a lot of receptors it binds to. So we can go study, okay, in the mouse we collected the livers of, we can go look at, are these pathways affected? Based on previous studies in other areas of the body, knowing what psilocybin affects. So yeah, we have to know a little bit of that field in general, but then obviously very specifically what we're doing, we have to know that in the greatest detail.
Do you think that you are fortunate enough that you have a very solid foundation thanks to previous studies on psilocybe? Does it make your research easier at some point?
It's actually funny that you bring this up. I find when there's less research out there on a topic, it's very easy for me to go learn everything about that area.
Yeah.
Right. And so when I started doing research in psychedelics, it was very easy because there was very little research out there that I would have to go read and learn about. But now we have so much psychedelic research happening right now and being published. It's like one of the biggest areas for research for a pharmaceutical. It must be the biggest area, other than maybe COVID, like the COVID vaccine. That's probably a bigger researched area, right? 100% is. But when there's more and more studies, it becomes more and more difficult because you have so much information and it becomes almost difficult to process all of that and stay up to date with things. But so it's kind of ironically, it's kind of the opposite of what you said. But when we have more and more data and more research, we get a better big picture of how psilocybin does anything to our bodies.
It doesn't make your research easier, but it gives you solid tools to know where you go.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's usually some random study comes out that's completely unrelated that I see it's like, oh, psilocybin affects this pathway. And then I think, okay, maybe I should go test this pathway in the liver now, right? So that does happen and that can give some guidance to us. But there's just so many capers in psilocybin now, all in all different areas. It's up to, I don't read them all. I don't read half of them because there's just too many that I could literally just read papers the next 2 years, just never sleeping, never doing anything other than just reading papers. Rant. And so obviously I can't do that. So I have to be specific of what I'm reading.
Did you already had a chance to work with a patient or a person that already had a previous condition and your research has helped at some point to improve health?
Yes, that's a great question. So our area that we're doing right now, it is very novel. And so no one has really used, that we're aware of, has used psilocybin as an anti-inflammatory. However, at least as of recently in Western societies. But when you go back and you look at some of the indigenous uses, they don't necessarily have the same diseases, and their understanding of diseases can be very different, especially, 500 years ago. Even in Western societies, 500 years ago, we didn't really understand diseases very well, right? But they might have used it in indigenous medicine to treat what their version of the disease was. And it could be very beneficial for them, but it's generally not as well written down. It's usually not in English, and so it becomes very difficult. And so it's a big thing in Canada and the US to partner with indigenous communities to get a better understanding of what they actually used it for to help guide us. I don't think that was in the case for this study. I think it was more we saw this 1 or 2 research papers coming out showing it affects the macrophages. And because of that, we're like, okay, well, then we need to go study this in multiple different organs. And so I think that's the case. But very likely there has been somebody in the past that had used it and they just didn't know about it. In particular for clinical studies, we haven't actually done any of that. This was really the basis to go to clinical studies. And so I'm a little bit out of touch with it now. I think the company Good Cap Pharmaceuticals, I know they partnered with the University of Toronto because they have a med school there and they can do clinical trials, like best clinical trials in the world, essentially. It's like up there with Harvard Medical School or some in California, right? And so I believe they have been approved to go to clinical trials. I know they submitted, and I don't want to say 100%, but very confident that they are approved or about to go to clinical trials. I don't think they'd started it yet, but I think they are about to go to it.
So something's brewing out there.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's very exciting that we're able to get it to that. And now we can go test it out in humans. Because obviously you don't really start in humans for a new therapeutic.
Logically.
Yeah, exactly. So
when you mention the positive effects, and you mention also as an anti-inflammatory, psilocybin as an anti-inflammatory, and then I wonder, the heart, like psilocybin on the heart. I'm very interested in that. What do you know about that? Did you do any side research of that or something?
So that's a good question. We did not do any research on the heart related to this study. Psilocybin in the heart is not a really well-studied area. Okay. We are the first animal study, unless there's been one recently. There is no other animal studies using psilocybin as an anti-inflammatory. I don't think it's been used for any other purpose. And I think one of the big reasons is that the heart is really well studied in terms of receptors and the downstream effects. And so I don't think there's any good therapeutic use case of using psilocybin to affect those receptors that would likely be beneficiating disease. That being said, there's always good reasons to do new research. But in particular, when we're talking about psilocybin, it's called the serotonin 2A receptor. That is the major receptor that does a lot of the activity of psilocybin. It binds to that receptor, and a lot of the times that's the receptor that transducts the signal and causes whatever psilocybin causes. It's not always the case. Psilocybin does bind to other receptors, but my understanding is the 2A receptor isn't really a very important receptor in the heart, at least therapeutically, that I'm aware of. It's funny that you bring up the heart, actually, is out of all of the potential side effects and concerns about safety, the heart is one that we need more research on about. It could actually potentially negatively affect the heart. And the main reason is that psilocybin is known to bind to a different receptor called the serotonin 2B receptor. And so there's been multiple drugs that have come out unrelated to psilocybin for various use cases, and it activates the 2B receptor. And they found in, I think it's majority in the US, that sometimes if it's a high enough activity and it induces enough signal through that 2B receptor, it can result in valvular disease in your heart. So it can make these bigger stenotic valves, causes a lot of heart problems. You might even have a heart attack. You can get a lot of problems with this, but it specifically acts on those valves. And so this is one area we don't really have much, if any, research on. And it is known to activate, or is known to bind to that receptor. We just don't know if it's strong enough to induce any negative effects. And when you go and look at all these other drugs that do bind to it, some of them do affect it and cause this valve disease and other heart-related diseases, but sometimes they don't. And so we have to really go and look at this in two ways. We have to go look at it clinically, so studying people that consume it and seeing long-term, do they get all these heart diseases? And is it more so than people that don't consume psilocybin? And then secondarily, what we can do is we can use animal studies. We can give psilocybin to the animals and then go, and we can give it to them multiple times. And then we can see after maybe a year. And so that, and for animal terms is, in human terms, that would be like 10, 20, 30 years, right? It's a much longer time frame, right? And so we can go look at, does it cause these stenotic valves in your heart of the mice, right? And if that's the case, then we would be very concerned. So I don't know if anyone is doing this currently. That is something that people should do. Now, one of the big concerns about this is that it's actually, if you were to take psilocybin once, which is generally what you need to have a strong antidepressive effect for 1 year. So clinical studies show after taking psilocybin once, a hallucinogenic dose, so you need a good amount, like 5 grams, let's say.
The Terence McKenna dose, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you need a good amount of it. And then once that happens, for the next year, it's been clinically shown, statistically significant, that you could have an antidepressant effect. So your depression will be much, much better by taking psilocybin once. It'll be better for the next full year, right? And I just don't think they've tested it past 12 months yet. So it couldn't even be longer than that. I just don't think we've tested it that long. When you take it once, it very likely will potentially bind to that 2D receptor in your heart. But because it's only there for a short period of time, it very likely does nothing. But this is where it's actually really important. If you were to microdose and you're consuming it every day over and over and over and over again, it now is in your body for, every day for maybe a year or two. And it's possible at that point, it might be enough cumulatively hitting that 2B receptor, the serotonin 2B receptor, that it now causes valve disease. So the big concern is, does microdosing cause heart valvular disease? And that's one that we just hadn't done enough studies on, because there's not much epidemiology on microdosing. So this is the human studies looking at anybody that's taken microdosing and does it result in valve disease. And nobody has really done the animal studies to go test this. And so that's a really important area that we need to go test to make sure it is safe, specifically for microdosing. Whereas all other potential concerns for safety reasons, I think there's almost none for psilocybin that is majorly concerning. We should do more research in what are the effects that psilocybin has in the brain, because some people, you might think it's changing the way your brain works, and we generally that's positive, but maybe people don't want to have those changes. And so that might be a negative side effect, that you might not want those changes. And so it really depends how you look at it. I think the only other major concern for psilocybin for safety is that there was this belief that you would have reoccurring hallucinations. And so this was back in the 70s and 60s. They found there was a low rate. So occasionally people would have reoccurring hallucinations. The problem with those studies was that they were confounded. So what that means is that the people consuming psilocybin consumed a lot of other drugs at the same time. And so what we found now with this explosion of research in psilocybin is that we would expect, as more and more people are taking it, more and more people are studying it, we would see this rate increase, that the amount of people having these recurring hallucinations would increase because more and more people are consuming psilocybin and we're able to study it better. we haven't seen that. So we're very confident that that doesn't happen because of psilocybin, and instead it's because of general certain drug use. And it's not actually because of psilocybin, it's just that general drug use, and because of that, we're not too concerned about that, like almost at all anymore.
I was aware that LSD, for example, which is a synthetic molecule basically,
Yep.
Indeed does leave some residues on the brain that reactivate later on. And I was aware that psilocybin doesn't make that phenomenon.
Yeah. So I was talking more there, the epidemiology behind it, but that's more the molecular basis of what is activity. But the epidemiology is it's not always the best case use. You want to have both, right? You want to have both. Why is this happening? And does epidemiology support this? Because epidemiology can sometimes be misleading, but when you get enough of it, and then you have a molecular basis, and then you can go test it in animals, and we can conclusively determine in animals, better assessment. Because of that, we can then go look at the epidemiology and say, okay, we're very confident with this now. Because sometimes you can have epidemiology that says consuming chocolate will prevent cancer, right? And that's just all by chance. And that actually is not the case. You might just have people consuming chocolate and they just don't have cancer, right? And so that's where you have to be a little bit cautious with epidemiology. But now we have epidemiology. We know a little bit better molecularly in what's happening in the body. So we're not really concerned about that anymore. But LSD and other drugs, those were some of those confounders in that original studies that showed it could cause these recurrent hallucinations. But other drugs, not really psilocybin.
It's very interesting, and I'm learning so much. Like, goodness gracious. I mentioned the heart because there is this recent, I think, overall recent discovery that the heart also has neurons, and that the heart also has neural connections.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's recent, but yes.
Yeah, it's kind of recent. No, well, maybe I just found out late about it, but
well, the heart, the way the heart works is it has an electrical pulse, right? And it's what causes your heart to beat, is that there is this electricity running through it, through these neurons, and they actually activate the heart muscle, right? So the same way as you use your muscle, your brain is telling through neurons to go activate your muscle, right? The way the heart works, though, is it's not your brain telling it. It has its own area that tells it. It's called the SA and AV nodes. And this produces an electrical pulse, and it goes down the Purkinje fibers, I believe it's called, and it activates the muscles within your heart to actually pulse, to contract. And it does it in a very specific way so that your heart pumps blood effectively, right? And so we've known this for a while. That's why when you do certain tests, so like an echocardiogram is what measures and uses, I believe, it's an ultrasound of the heart, so you can look at it. But then there's what's called an electrocardiogram. And that is where you'll see people put these electrodes on your heart and on your body, well, on your heart, sorry, on your chest and your back. And they can actually see the electrical waves. And so you might have seen on a screen, it like this thing going up and down, especially when you're in a hospital. They usually attach those to you so we can see the activity of your heart.
like an ECG, right?
Yeah, it's like there's a machine that has these little electrodes that it's like a little thing, like a little circular thing you just put on your chest.
Yeah.
Usually they put like 5 or 10 on. Usually on the front and like 1 or 2 on your back.
That measures electrical.
The electric conductivity within your heart. And so if this electrical pulse stops, your heart stops. For the most part, stops beating. So you need these neurons, obviously. But this is really more internal, and it could potentially affect those, but I don't think it will be interesting to look at that. We have not got that far, and I would think we probably won't for a long time, but I would highly doubt that would be a major thing to study. One way that therapeutically that could be studied is with people or animals, if you're studying animals. If you have an electrical conductivity problem, so your heart isn't actually beating correctly because the pulse isn't really working. It's generally what happens is that there might be misfirings in your heart because of potentially the conductivity and the neurons aren't going to the myocardium appropriately in an organized fashion. So it's possible that psilocybin could affect that. But that's, I would think, is probably not it's probably wouldn't do anything therapeutic, to be honest. But it's a possibility. It would be interesting to look at that. I think looking at inflammation is a much more important thing to do, especially even in the heart, because there is inflammation in the heart. So I would think that would be a more rational next step if we want to look at it therapeutically in the heart. But yeah, there are neurons in the heart for sure.
What are the milestones that you have achieved on your way to your PhD, and what are the milestones that are coming for the next months?
Sure. Yeah, it's really good questions. So I started my PhD in beginning of 2021, and we have fully completed this animal study. So we not only got ethics approved to go do it, we then did it. We basically, in a matter of one summer, we tested, I believe, over 200 animals. We had to administer the psilocybin and eugenol. We had to inject them with LPS, and then we'd have to go collect the organs of them. And obviously, we did this in a humane way. It passed ethics. So there's, you don't have to worry about that. We did it. We then had to go do some various molecular techniques on it. So we had to extract like the proteins and RNA and go do testing on it, then statistically analyze it, and just show what is happening there. And that takes a long time. And so we did this study in the summer of 2022. And so we've published now from this. So when it gets to publication, it's like we've done everything and now we're just showing it to everybody else, right? And other experts in the field will go look at these papers and see, before it's published, and see, is this worthy of being published, right? And so we publish now, I think we've done 2 papers on the brain, and there was a couple of studies that I did prior to starting this animal study. This was on cells. We wanted to test, is psilocybin going to be cytotoxic? So is it going to kill cells? Is it going to, in a cellular model, prevent the production of these pro-inflammatory cytokines, which it did, it prevented that. We also tested other compounds other than eugenol, and we paired it with psilocybin. And the whole idea behind this is we want to reduce, we want to have psilocybin as low a dose as possible for microdosing. So we can add something else, and they work synergistically together. We can reduce the dose of psilocybin significantly by pairing it with something else. And so we tested all these different compounds and found eugenol and psilocybin appeared to have a synergistic effect, so that you didn't have to have a full dose that, obviously if you're taking that every day and you're hallucinating every day, that's not a great thing. So we can microdose it, and we can even push it really, really low so that we can try to avoid any of those potential side effects like valve disease if you were to take it.
Sorry for introduction. What's the smallest psilocybin dose that doesn't give you hallucinogenic effects but gives you the beneficial effects?
Ooh, that's a really tough question. I don't know if we've even can conclusively say that. So in our study, we looked at in cells, right? And then we actually did what's called 3D tissue. So it's, you take these cells and you grow them in something that looks something like, we did this in the intestines, because that's where you're absorbing the psilocybin, right? Where you take it orally. And so we did both cells and the intestines, and we just did a range of doses. And so this is, we're talking like micromoles per liter. It can get quite low. There's really no easy translation to what that would be in the body. You can make some estimates. I don't have that off the top of my head. Even if you make those estimates, therapeutically, it's not useful. You need to go test that in humans. It also depends on what the benefit you're looking at, probably, right? So we know that there are certain benefits like depression. You can have the best benefit by having, a full hallucinogenic dose. And there has been studies that show not only do you need a full hallucinogenic dose to have 12 months of beneficial effects, you actually want to have a very strong spiritual response during that dose. And so there is some believing that if you take a little bit more than, say, 5 grams, and you have a stronger hallucinogenic response, you'll have better effects. And it's not necessarily the dose size, but it's actually how your body responds to it. And if the more spiritual that experience is when you are hallucinating, the stronger the benefits are, which is a really interesting finding, and we don't know why, but that has held up epidemiologically, meaning When this happens, we see the correlation between the two and it's statistically significant, meaning very unlikely it's happening by chance. It could be happening for other reasons. It might not be this spiritual event results in this happening. It could be something else is causing both to happen. The beneficial effects and the spiritual event is caused by something else, right? So it's not the one leads to the other. It could be they just both happen to happen when something is happening that is causing this. That makes sense?
Yeah, I think it does. And in fact, that's one of the things that most amazes me, that there's a correlation between whatever spirituality can scientifically mean and the biological chemical effects on the body, which is astounding. Right now, for you as a student, probably a very successful future researcher on this topic, how hard or difficult, how easy it is to get funding for your research?
Oh, it's for funding in Canada, it's always very difficult, especially in the United States. You have a lot more competition you have more money, but a lot more competition. And that competition really makes the best researchers, specifically at writing, right? You have to write a proposal and it has to be the best writing in the entire world, showing that this is going to have amazing benefits for humankind, regardless of even if it does, just to get funding, right? In Canada, we are a little more easier to get funding than the US, but the funding is usually less by a lot, right? So in the US, you might get, a $10 million grant, US dollars, right? In Canada, you might get 200, 300,000, right? So it definitely is easier to get that in Canada. And there's multiple different funding agencies in every country. But in Canada, we have had a lot of success because we've created our own corporation. And in Canada, they really want to promote that entrepreneurialism and using a corporation to fund research. And so we have worked with the government through a program to get multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so that's amazing, right? And so that's great. We're almost at the point that the funding that I have been responsible for, not just with psilocybin, but with everything that I've done is almost past $1 million. Now, I don't have $1 million. I wish I did. That does not go to me. That's for the research, right? And so that's paying for housing the animals, paying for people to help out, paying for all the resources that is used, right? It's not just $1 million to me. I wish it was. I don't get almost any of it, right? So, yeah.
But you get experience, you get a solid research. Yes. You get a freaking PhD.
Yeah, as long as I pass. So that is where I'm at right now. And so we published multiple papers. So I think at this point we've done 4 papers in total related to psilocybin from this project. 2 is the animal study. 1 is this 3D intestinal tissue. And then another one's the cells. I have 2 more papers that we're going to publish. One of them was just submitted recently. So hopefully that one will be out. And that will be on the liver. And then at that point, so there's a thing called comprehensive exams. Basically, if you fail a PhD, this is when you would fail it. And I did this 2 years ago. I passed that. So now I'm just finishing writing these papers and then writing my thesis. And then I basically get in front of some experts and they ask me a bunch of questions for 3 hours. And if they allow you to go in front of those people, usually you pass. So I'm probably looking at within the next year or 2, I will graduate from my PhD. Yeah, that's where we're at currently.
It's awesome. I wish you lots of success, of course, and congratulations for all the work you've done until now and that you're going to keep doing, of course.
Thanks.
And for wrapping it up because I think we are on an hour almost, maybe two more questions. One is that I'm interested on the detoxifying aspects of psilocybin. Does it help with detoxifying? Like you mentioned the liver, so it might have a relationship there.
What do you mean toxify?
Detoxify, like health.
Detoxify?
Yeah, does psilocybin help in detoxifying and cleaning the body in some sort of way?
That's, I'm not 100% sure. And I don't know if it has been thoroughly studied. Generally, when we think about psilocybin, we're more concerned it might have, specifically in the liver, it might have a toxic effect. The study, we haven't published this yet, and this is the one we have got submitted to a journal to publish. It doesn't show any real toxic effects from our study. So that's a good sign because you would think when you add some exogenous, so something outside of your body that's not produced, drug, and that goes into your body. So when you take some sort of drug, the concern is that the liver might have a toxic response. Like when you take alcohol, you consume it enough, it's bad for your liver. It can cause some serious liver diseases. You don't even have to have that much. Just a little bit for a long time, that can result in liver disease. And it can cause some serious changes, not just functionally, but it can structurally change the liver. And so what we've shown is that the liver, when you give it psilocybin, and so what we did is we did 2 doses, either after having inflammation, or we did, we gave 1 dose after having inflammation, which was an injection with this LPS compound. And we also tried 2 days before. We gave it twice, once a day. And we didn't find that psilocybin caused any structural changes to the liver, as well as it did not appear to have any functional change in what can be tested. So we know it didn't cause toxic problems. And interestingly enough, eugenol by itself did cause a little bit of toxic effects, but not psilocybin. And so that is an interesting finding. It is known eugenol at high doses can cause toxic effects, but having that as a comparison and showing psilocybin, which is what most people think is a drug, and eugenol is a natural compound found in plants that people eat. It found in, I think it's like various different plants that people will eat, and the actual like vegetables you can find eugenol in. And so because of this, it's interesting that something that's natural that many people eat is more toxic for your liver than psilocybin is really interesting. And it goes to show that it's probably beneficial. Does it detoxify? I don't even know. That's a tough one. I don't think there has been thorough research into that. And when you say detoxify, I question what is the toxins we're looking at, right? So that's a tough one. But in terms of inflammation, yes, it can detoxify inflammation, like these pro-inflammatories that gas to your blood.
I was heading that way, but I couldn't formulate the question correctly. But yeah.
So we've even tested the blood in our animal studies, and we do show that there are certain inflammatory properties that are decreased. There even is some clinical studies that have looked at this, and I don't think there was a huge change, but also it was like people were self-reporting using psilocybin once. We would expect for detoxifying, you probably have to microdose for that, if that was the effect there.
Awesome. I think for now we got an amazing episode of almost 1 hour. I would like to use this last minutes to you sharing your social media, your accounts, where people can follow you. If you have podcast or blog or whatever, share that now.
Yeah. So definitely anybody that wants to follow the research, if you Google Gregory Ian Robinson, Google Scholar, so that will pull up my sort of research page on Google. And you can then go find us. If you were to Google my name and psychedelic mushrooms, you're going to find us, or psilocybin, you're going to find us. Probably see some various research papers, but the best way is just go on Google Scholar or on ResearchGate, which is a similar thing by a different company. That's probably the best way to keep in touch that way. If you guys want to, I do have an Instagram and Twitter, and I believe both of those are Greg Ian Robinson. On both, and that's another way. I do post our papers on Twitter, and then more personally on Instagram. That's usually what I do. But definitely you can follow there and learn more about what we do going forward. And hopefully you guys participate and join in.
Awesome. I will surely be following you because you're amazing, and what you're doing is very interesting to me. Thanks for your cooperation with this first episode, and I'm super thankful for having you here. Remember that if you want to contribute with the podcast of wisdom, and if you like the content that I share with you, you have ways to contribute financially. Read in the description and you will find a couple of ways. I'm also really having to do the premium tier for my Patreon page. I'm still learning how to do a podcast, so bear with me. But yeah, you have ways to contribute and to make this project happen. Thanks for your attention. I hope you really like this podcast episode, and have a nice new beginning of the year. 2025 will be an amazing year for you and for me, and I think we are all going to enjoy the experience. Thanks, Gregory. Thank you so much. Have a very wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Cosmic wisdom flowing just for you and me. All right. Welcome to the podcast where we we set you free. We got the groove and the wisdom you adore. Yeah, come and join the journey, 'cause there's always more. Cosmic Wisdom Podcast, rocking every day. Press play and let the magic take you away.